Okay, very good evening if you're in India, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the rest of the world. This is Orko Chattopadhyay. I teach in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Gandhinagar. And we are very happy and privileged to have Dr. Patricia Gherovici today as our speaker for this Humanities and Social Sciences talk on her book, Transgender Psychoanalysis. She'll talk about a particular aspect of the book. Before we do a formal introduction, and for that I would request Parul, my doctoral student, to sort of, set the ball rolling. But before that, first and foremost, let me just make a few housekeeping announcements. Once we have the talk and when we open the floor for questions, it'll be great if you could write down the questions in the chat box first. If you think you have a very long question which is difficult to write, please ping in the chat box. I will ask you to unmute yourself and you can then unmute yourself and speak, right? So that's the way we'll go about things in terms of the chat box logistics. And it'll be great if you could please turn off your audio and video. I think with the setting that we have, the audio is already turned off, but it'll be great if we, I mean, it's fine if you want to keep the video off, but video on, but it's up to you. But yeah, I'm just trying to make sure we don't have sonic interference here. So thank you so much, Patricia, for making out time. I know it has been difficult with all the time zone differences and you're busy, and we are honored to have you here. And Patricia actually truly does not need an introduction for anyone who works in the field of psychoanalysis, be it in the clinical dimensions or the critical dimensions. She has written and contributed so much work in various directions, but I think her work resonates with this very significant social and political dimension of psychoanalysis, which is sometimes somewhat neglected in the discussions. And that's, I think, one of the greatest aspects of her work, be it talking about psychoanalysis outside Europe or psychoanalysis and the purchase on transgenderism. Again, to go back to Jacques Lacan's famous but very simple definition of discourse, a discourse is that which makes a social link. And psychoanalytic discourse is one of the 4+1 discourses that Lacan formulated. So there's always a social bond or a social link involved in psychoanalytic discourse. And I think work such as the one Dr. Gherovici would present today is replete with that social political underpinning of psychoanalysis as a clinical practice. So with that, I would request Parul to kindly introduce her formally, and we will get going from there. So Parul, over to you. Thank you so much.
So Dr. Patricia Gherovici is a psychoanalyst, analytic supervisor, and recipient of the 2020 Sigourney Award for her clinical and scholarly work with Latinx and gender variant communities. She is co-founder and director of the Philadelphia Lacan Group and associate faculty, Psychoanalytic Studies Minor, University of Pennsylvania. Honorary member at IPTAR and founding member of Das Unbehang. Her single-authored books include The Puerto Rican Syndrome, winner of the Gradiva Award and the Boyer Prize, Please Select Your Gender, from the Invention of Hysteria to the Democratizing of Transgenderism, and Transgender Psychoanalysis, a Lacanian Perspective on Sexual Difference. She edited 2 volumes with Manya Steinkoler, Lacan On Madness, Madness, Yes You Can't, and Lacan, Psychoanalysis and Comedy. Most recently, she published with Chris Christian Psychoanalysis in the Barrios, Race, Class, and the Unconscious, winner of the Gradiva Award for Best Edited Collection and the American Board and Academy of Psychoanalysis Book Prize. She will speak for 45 to 50 minutes, following which we will have a round of question and answer. So now I request Dr. Gherovici to start her lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all see me. Let me know if there is any problem with always this complex times situation of being technologically connected. I wish we would be all in the same room. On the other hand, gives me the opportunity of realizing the fantasy of being in two places or maybe several places at the same time, different time zones, different continents. But hopefully the common language of our interest in psychoanalysis. I first of all want to thank Professor Arka Chattopadhyay for the invitation and the opportunity. I'm very honored to be able to be giving this talk at HSS IIT Kandiganar and have the opportunity of sharing my work with you today. What I would like to share with you today, it comes as the consequence of two published works that came to me as is most of the work for psychoanalysts. We are guided by what we learn in the clinical practice. I continue, and today I hope will be another opportunity. I continue exploring what I'm learning, guided by analysans who identify as trans, and I feel my encounter, clinical encounter, what I hear in my practice is an opportunity to rethink the theory and also take advantage in a way of the transformative power that the clinical experience has, that it is the encounter with patients, what one hears, one learns, what allows to advance psychoanalytic thinking, and in terms of my own work, allows me to expand my previous claims. What I will be focusing today will be on gender, sexuality, and embodiment. And as we heard in the introduction, all these issues are, of course, politically determined. We cannot think, as Freud himself said, when we look closely to individual psychology, the individual subject is also social. Individual psychology is social psychology at the same time. So we are always working at the two levels. My work with the issues about gender started more than 20 years ago, in the late 1990s, in the quiet solitude of my psychoanalytic consulting room in Philadelphia. I would have never thought I was going to revise my notions of gender and delve into the deep waters of identity politics until I heard something unusual in what my patients were talking about. I heard from my mostly female identified patients the question, am I straight or am I bisexual? I noted, in fact, that they were asking more and more questions like, am I a man or a woman? And what does that mean? And I linked this uncertainty about their gender with other analysans who identify as trans, for whom their suffering was not so much around the question itself, but rather about the answer to this question about gender identity. They would often claim, for instance, I am a man, but happen to be assigned female at birth, or I cannot believe that I was born female and now I'm a trans man. Or despite my male organs, I always knew I was a woman. When someone changes gender, the very possibility of embodying a different gender from the one they were born with implies that the body is not a given, is not a fixed entity, but entails a process of embodiment, a becoming of the body. As the expression in English illustrates very well, to have a body shows that one is not a body, that having a body, while at the same time one is in a body, being in a body, requires a process, requires a process of assuming the body one inhabits. Therefore, both who question their gender and those people who move between the gender divide to relocate somewhere in between or do without it altogether, they show a disjunction between the subjective sense of one's body and its materiality. However, for both cis, meaning those who say gender identification corresponds to what gender they have been assigned at birth, or for transgender people. In both cases, what we are seeing is that the assumption of a sexual body appears very often as a conundrum. And to deal with this conundrum, I have to start with a confession. Psychoanalysis has a sex problem in more sense than one. Historically, psychoanalysis has, or I would say more psychoanalytic institutions. I think it's important to maybe pluralize psychoanalysis, but most orthodox and classical versions of psychoanalysis have tended to adopt a very normative position, reading any deviation from the socially accepted norm, among them transsexuality, as sign of pathology and reasons to segregate and exclude. The interesting and shocking thing is that nothing could be farther away from what one learns in the clinical practice as a psychoanalyst. Sex has always been a problem, not just for psychoanalysis. The story is well known. Psychoanalysis was born in Vienna the end of the end of the 1895. We may put a date. Is Vienna. Freud is there, listening to patients who complain of mysterious ailments from which traditional medicine could not find a solution or even an explanation. There was something happening in the body: paralysis, blindness, mutism, seizures, strange symptoms that defied scientific knowledge and revealed to be sexual in origin. Behind the hysterical bodily symptom, there was a repressed sexual content. Initially, Freud believed that as a child, the hysterical patient had been the victim of a premature, traumatic, and erotic experience, such as a sexual seduction by an adult. Too immature to understand it, unable to represent it, the child was frightened and speechless, and the sexual excitation was excluded from the child's awareness. The seduction was forgotten or repressed, but would come back later in the future, reawakening hysteric symptoms, which meant the return of the repressed. The unbearable, sexually charged traumatic representation was an integral part of Freud's seduction theory. He would eventually abandon this theory and came to believe in a principle of psychic reality, where the trauma would be inscribed in the unconscious, imprinted as fantasy. Freud's abandonment of the seduction theory introduced the concept of fantasy. And the concept of fantasy led him to discover the existence of the drive, which in German Freud called Trieb, and it has been mistranslated into English as instinct, losing the sense of this sexual drive, a border concept between flesh and language. We could define sex for the speaking being as the rapport between two fantasies and the resulting interaction of two subjects through the lens of their fantasies. One classic trope is that of an heterosexual man having sex with a woman while thinking he's having sex with another woman. Meanwhile, I'm talking about an heterosexual setup. Meanwhile, the woman is thinking about this other woman and thinking she's her, and she identifies with the woman her partner is thinking about. We can see that fantasies play a crucial role in all aspects of our psychic life. Before and after the seduction theory, Freud continued granting great psychic importance to sexual experiences and not limiting them to cases of hysteria, but somehow generalizing sexual trauma as a feature of human sexuality, a main feature. For Freud, psychic reality was dominated by the primacy of a sexuality that was skewed, queer, we may say. To listen to the unconscious is truly to be able to pay attention to the unconscious productions, be it in the clinical office or in everyday life, we are dealing perhaps with issues that relate to this kernel of sex, sexual identity, and sexuality. And specifically, analytic work delves into the complex relationship of the body and the psyche, highlighting the precariousness of gender, the instability of the male-female opposition, and the fragility of sexual identification, features which reach back to the basis from the foundations of Freudian psychoanalysis. Freud discoveries at his time met with very strong resistance, and the unconscious he was proposing was something that people preferred to ignore and maybe continue trying to ignore. One interesting observation is that in the context of the United States, often there is a semantic displacement. The word unconscious in everyday language is often replaced by subconscious. It's as if all the disruptive power of the unconscious proposed by Freud would be replaced by this word subconscious as a sort of underground, lower level subconsciousness, implying a lower hierarchy. It's as if there is something disruptive in the unconscious that we want to, at least in an everyday use of language, ignore. The knowledge that Freud disseminated was resisted because it touched upon something that was beyond morality. Freud's finding forced a confrontation with the dark core in the subject that corresponds to an ethics of desire of which we want to remain ignorant. This is one of the main scandals Freud caused by his discoveries. His notions of sexuality was so ample that troubled the traditional boundaries of what was considered sexual. This is one of the scandals of Freud. What Alenka Zupanqui, the philosopher, argues is that, curiously enough, what Freud created and what was more disruptive in his proposition was, and this is one irony that often people accuse Freud of being pansexualist, but the irony is that this sexuality that is supposed to be everywhere, in fact, is nowhere to be found. That there is something uncertain about human sexuality. And I will quote Zupanqui. It says, what is most disturbing in the Freudian discovery is not the emphasis on sexuality, the emphasis on dirty matters. More disturbing was the ontological uncertain character of sexuality itself. So when I say that sexuality is constitutively unconscious, I refer to some fundamental negativity implied in sexuality, yet which gives as such the structure of the unconscious. Furthermore, quote, the cause of embarrassment in sexuality is not simply something which is there on display in it, but on the contrary, something that is precisely not there, end quote. So we see this recalcitrant nothingness, this void at the heart of sexuality. And this deficit in our relationship to sex is expressed, for instance, if we compare the animal experience, where she seemed to rely very successful on the wisdom granted by instinct, humans, we need the pedagogical mediation of sexual education, for instance. We need to be told the story of these bees and flowers. We need to learn something that we should know already. Not only we are at a loss facing sexuality, but our encounter with sexuality is disruptive and exposes our passion for ignorance. As Freud listened to patients who complain of mysterious ailments for which traditional medicine could not find a solution or even an explanation, he developed a form of clinical treatment, a method, and a theory called psychoanalysis. And this allow him to construct a new version of sexuality that in the early days he connected with the theory of bisexuality. Many of you may know the story of his collaboration with his close friend William Fries. And this friendship came to an end among bitter accusations of plagiarism, but also a big disagreement around the issue of bisexuality. The standstill was when Freud tried to give what we may call a non-essentially psychoanalytic definition of the notions of masculine and feminine, a task made even more difficult because bisexuality, we may wonder what is this bi in bisexuality, implies a binarism that already cannot be sustained by one early proposition of Freud when he talked that there is only one libido that he described as male, masculine libido. So bisexuality could open two divergent paths. One would be close to that of Wilhelm Fliess, that stands us on the line of biology, hormone treatment, medical thinking of the human body, and even of reassignment, sexual identity. On the second path, we come closer to, for instance, a thesis defended by Stephen Angelides in 2001, namely that bisexuality has functioned historically as an structural other to sexual identity itself, undermining assumptions about heterosexuality and homosexuality. And this latter notion has contemporary relevance because it can challenge orthodox assumptions about gender and sexual development. We may say that Freud's early difficulties with the notion of bisexuality revealed the impossibility of defining either masculinity or femininity, that bisexuality is not a third kind of sexual identity, but what we may see in bisexuality is the limitations of and the impossibility of bilaterality, of binary, sexual binary, that Freud notes and talks about the non-representability of, for instance, what he calls the enigma of woman. And I'm referring here, for instance, to a lecture he gave in the 1930s when he talked about the riddle of the nature of femininity. And he avoided falling into the trap of an impossible task, describing what a woman is. He rather wondered, and here we see Freud in a way preceded certain feminist thinking, that rather than trying to define what a woman is, he asked the question, how does a woman become? How does she come into being? How a woman develops out of a child with a bisexual disposition. And also, Freud was aware of a paradox such as, and I quote Freud, when you meet a human being, the first distinction you make is male or female, and you're accustomed to make that distinction with unhesitating certainty, end quote. But nevertheless, it is impossible to give to the concepts of masculine and feminine any new connotation. And Freud would say this distinction is not a psychological one. So we see that this already Freud is positioning himself, talking about we may call today sexual difference, in a way that deals with difference as an incommensurable difference. From one sex to the other, all we have is difference. We have a logical jump between genders. There is difference. That's from the start. And this gap, this discontinuity, is something that Lacan steps in when he proposes this dictum that there is not such a thing as a sexual relation. We could here then see that Freud's elaborations of Freud's idea of, in a way, leads to what Lacan would systematize later on under the so-called formula of sexuation. If the libido is masculine in nature, and for the unconscious, there is no representation of the other sex, of the female sex, then the unconscious is in a way monosexual or homosexual in the sense of same-sexual. So there is only one signifier. We see how Lacan rereads Freud using as a guide the idea of sexual difference following a notion of a phallus working as a signifier. If we read Freud, there could be perhaps a confusion between anatomy and a signifier. For Lacan, this is clear. The phallus is not an anatomical organ, even though an anatomical organ may be ascribed with a phallic function. He's talking about a signifier, something that could not be reducible to anatomy. A sexual difference for Lacan, or what he called sexuation, could offer us a model to think how a subject may assume a gender, an identity, a positioning, as a woman, a man, or anything else altogether, without fully relying on the notion of the phallus. What we could start thinking about, if we follow this path set up by Freud and Lacan, is that we are talking about a division, a difference that operates at the level of the unconscious, that is not determined by sex, understood as anatomy, nor by gender, understood as a social construction, but rather about something else that is neither sex nor gender. The assumption of any sexual position is an unconscious choice, a forced choice, that has to do with a beyond, something that goes beyond maybe anatomical difference or its psychic consequences or social conventions, that has to do with this basic disharmony, this negativity, this void at the core of human sexuality. And what I think is important to take, and I take in my clinical work from Lacan, is that the formula of sexuation allows us to think of in terms of a logic of unconscious investments, a division that is based on two forms of being. And he's talking about being masculine, being feminine, and these forms of being are determined about forms of enjoyment, or using the Lacanian terminology, forms of jouissance, that Lacan defines as phallic and other, or feminine, not fully subjected, not all subjected to the phallus. So we are clearly here freed from the shackles of anatomy, and we are led onto the direction of something that we could think in terms of self-authorization in speech, that this sexual position has to do with a different, we may say, ethical position facing sexual difference. This position provided by Lacan, if we follow the formula of sexuation, is helpful to be considered in conjunction with what he developed later in his thinking as the notion of sinthome. Something that I develop in both my books, Please Select Your Gender and Transgender Psychoanalysis. This sinthome refers to a new type of symptom that is taken away from the medical field. It's not a symptom that needs to be cured or eliminated, but rather is a symptom that is more like a creative invention, not something to get rid of, but something that makes up for the disharmony between genders, that makes do around this disjunction. What one often, for instance, sees in cases of gender transitioning is that the corporeal reconstruction is not enough, does not suffice to hold the body. Not only the material interventions in the body, hormonal, surgical, are enough. A full transformation of the body only is acquired when something in terms of what we may call an artifice, a creation, a renaming, a sort of writing or inscription takes place, that only then a more livable embodiment is accomplished. And here, if I'm talking about livable embodiments, we are dealing with something that's observed already by Freud in a late text of 1937, Analysis Terminable and Interminable. Freud there, he observes that when psychoanalysis is completed, a residue of the drive will remain forever incomprehensible and will always constitute a source of disharmony for the subject, In other words, even at the end of an analysis, an impasse will remain. And this impasse is indicative of a conflict, and moreover of an irreconcilable conflict between subjects and their sexual being. He called this conflict the rock of castration. Also, he called it the repudiation of femininity that we could maybe rephrase as a repudiation of otherness. And this repudiation occurs in people of any gender. Since this repudiation has to do with a repudiation happened to beings who are sexual, I will call this repudiation the rock of castration or the rock of death, since a fundamental feature of the unconscious is the belief in its own immortality. And yet, we are all condemned to death, and this castration is universally repudiated. This rock of death is often heard in the clinical practice, and at times appears behind gender issues. For instance, when an analysand says, I had no choice. I would be dead if I didn't transition. I would have killed myself. My clinical experience has shown me that gender transition is more often than not an issue of life or death. It starts often with the body, and then it moves on to finding a way of living this body as a place one cannot live, one cannot elude. We are in a way all trapped in our mortal bodies. An embodiment itself incorporates death. In my clinical experience, I have encountered people whose entire being is consumed by a constant rumination about life and death. Gender transition is more about mortality, about the limit between life and death, than about sexuality, the border between male and female. And I could maybe find examples, for instance, in literature, we could see in what Leslie Feinberg has described as, and I quote her, I think how nice it would be to unzip my body from forehead to navel and go on vacation, but there is no escaping. I will have to pack myself along. Or Jan Morris, who reiterates a similar wish, writing, all I wanted was liberation or reconciliation, to live as myself, to clothe myself in a more proper body and achieve identity at last. But if this is not accomplished, this is what Morris says. If I were trapped in that cage again, nothing would keep me from my goal, not even the prospect of death itself. So if we factor in death, then the alternative sex or gender is false, because sexual difference is neither sex nor gender, but something else that needs to be dealt with, and it has to do with this ontological question, this negativity, this void. And then we are dealing with something that cannot be symbolized or imagined. Like God and death, sex belongs to the troika of unrepresentables. The attempt to represent sexuality directly encounters an impossibility that is presented as in psychoanalysis as sexual difference. And this concerns a failure of representation at the center of language. And this failure is confronted always about a certain imperative, a failed imperative to represent sexuality, as Charles Shepperson notes. Words will always fail to represent sexuality. There is we may even define the unconscious as this impossibility between sexuality and representation. And this ontological statement would be at the core of psychoanalysis, and is what Alenka Supanki says is the main philosophical problem proposed by psychoanalysis, this negativity that defies completion. And it's precisely in this negativity where psychoanalysis has productive potential insofar as it resists any heteronormative political and social mandate. But let's return to the clinic. There is where maybe all these ideas could acquire a more clear dimension. And I will talk about Jay, who started analysis describing himself as someone with a mild addiction problem. Moreover, Jay identified as a trans man, but this is not why he came to analysis. He had what we may call no gender trouble, to play with Judy Butler's definition. He passed, he was socially accepted as a man, never uncomfortable in social situations, nobody ever misgendered him, never a need to correct pronouns. As for the addiction, he defined as a social user, and interestingly enough, despite some episodes of binging, weekends of smoking marijuana non-stop, and alcohol binges, for Jay, the addiction was not a problem, was in fact something that gave him a belonging into a group. Addict was a sort of name, a label tied to a group, and offered to Jay an identification with what he considered a countercultural model. It was sort of, we may use the definition in Lacanian terms of an master signifier, an S1, something outside of meaning, a pointing to itself that gave Jay an illusion of mastery and a semblance of social connection. So initially, Jay, curiously enough, did not identify any symptom besides a generalized malaise. But nevertheless, he was quite enthusiastic about undergoing psychoanalysis. He, in fact, loved being in psychoanalysis. He found it, despite this enthusiasm for the process was quite challenging. It was very difficult for Jay to speak in the sessions. I took this resistance as a good indication. His enthusiastic transference found a counterpoint in his difficulty to bring himself to speak in the session. His words were often interspersed with very long silences. His apparent assurance and eagerness was in fact allowing to reveal a sense of great solitude and fragility. Occasionally, he would ask me for advice, making a request as if I was supposed to embody a master that would provide direction, a direction from which, of course, he could stray. There were moments where his enthusiasm bordered on impulsivity, a quasi-manic drive that was in fact a request to the big other to be complete, or to try to complete himself, the big other. His quest was to create an omnipotent big other capable of managing, controlling, and supervising him. Here there was an interesting paradox. While his drug use could look like he was abandoning himself to the voracious pool of jouissance, the way Jay organized his drug intakes or his alcohol binges was not as spontaneous, but very calculated. He wanted to make himself hurt. He was a master of self-inflicting pain. I make myself suffer seemed to be his motto. It turned out that Jay consulted me because his pain calculation was getting out of hand. Jay's recent girlfriend, a cis woman who identified as queer, had moved in with him a month before he started treatment. But he consulted, in fact, I believe, because their relationship was becoming extremely volatile, extremely violent. They were full-on screaming fights, and on a few occasions, the fights only ended when the neighbors called up the police. All the while, Jay was feeling very much in conflict with his girlfriend. He was constantly tortured because he believed that his girlfriend was sending messages on the phone, text messages, flirting with ex-boyfriends. In fact, Jay was suspicious of his girlfriend called Marty. They had what he thought was a good sexual relation. But in fact, he was convinced that Marty did not enjoy sex as much with him because he happened to be a trans man. He believed, Jay, that the phallus was in fact the penis, and he felt deprived of an organ to which he ascribed a great value. And he felt somehow at a disadvantage having sex with a cis woman like Marty. In fact, gradually, as the relationship continued, he started avoiding opportunities of having sex altogether and started avoiding intimacy. In a way, he was constructing or reinforcing his role as a rejected partner, victimized by Marty's seeming lack of interest. And he also started fantasizing having sex with a gay cis man and imagining himself during sex as a cis man having a penis. And often after sex, he felt very sad. In the middle of this stormy moment in the relationship with Marty, of course, the waters of the analysis became quite troubled. They started to question the impact of the treatment and complain about the uselessness of psychoanalysis. At the same time, the presentation of Jay started to change. He was not drinking as much or getting high so often, but he started gaining weight. It looked like the object A, the object cause of desire, was stuck in the oral zone. It was all food and screaming. Jay complained about not feeling attracted anymore. And at this very juncture, there was an interesting slip of the tongue that proved revelatory. In this apparently endless cycle of repetitions and maybe this festival of the death drive, Jay mentioned that he would affectionately call Marty, his girlfriend, Ma. In a session that was immediately after a huge fight that precipitated that Marty would move out of the house for a few days, Jay reported the confrontation in a voice that exposed a mix of pain and pleasure, a sort of enjoyment and despair. And he became aware of this quality in his account. It's as if he was hurting so good in this painful situation. And he had, at that moment, a revelatory slip of the tongue. Trying to say ma, he stuttered and said ma, ma, and I repeated back to him, mama. He seemed annoyed and replied, not ma, not mama. At this point, he appeared utterly confused. We ended the session there. This welcome interruption, this slip of the tongue, brought about something new. The following session, Jay acknowledged that the fights, in particular the physical violence with Marty, provided an exhilarating sensation similar to his drunken highs. The excitement related to the continuous disappointment he had experienced with his father, the parent that was not mama. There was a history of absence on the paternal side, and in a way, Jay interpreted this absence of the father as a confirmation that nothing existed beyond his mother love, and nothing itself became an object he searched for in his alcohol and drug-induced high. And often, and this is important, Jay would enjoy a lot being hungover. He didn't mind the headache, he didn't mind the physical malaise. He cherished the after effects of the hangover when he would feel nothing. After the fights, maybe there was regret, but there was a sort of resignation to self-destruction that muted his guilt. The interpellation of the superego was momentarily silenced. And we could see here that the drugs, the drinks, even the fights function as stoppers in a void that remained concealed, plugged, veiled by the actual object. It's the same void that Jay experienced post-coitum in this sadness he experienced. But it's important that he said, correcting me, not mama. This no had a no that Jay was able to articulate, had a good effect in his progression, because a few sessions later, Jay noticed that while his nickname for Marty was Ma, the nickname that Jay received from Marty was Dumpling. Jay stopped himself mid-sentence and repeated to himself, "Dump? Dump?" I asked. He replied, "Yes, this is what Ma is doing, treating me like shit." At stake in their interaction was the object A as physis. Shit was a substitute for Jay, but also a memorial to an early loss. The first gift the child relinquishes, a prototype for the inscription of lack, the sacrifice object that separates jouissance from desire. Tired, as Jay said, of being an asshole, tired of this type of jouissance, Jay broke up with Marty soon after. Then there was a time in the treatment where he dated casually. He started going to the gym, exercise. There was a nice narcissistic boost, feeling again better in his body. Met a new girlfriend who was in a way the opposite of Marty, a little older than Jay, never confrontational, described by Jay as lovely, beautiful, perfect, an ideal femme, cute, thin. And at this point, Jay no longer engaged in drug use or heavy drinking, but a new symptom emerged, in a way pushed by two elements. There was, on the one hand, this new girlfriend, Alisa, who was, as Jay said, so much into me. She has such energy, such desire for me. I can't believe it. She's all over me. It freaks me out. And then again, the jealousy came into play, and I think another return of the death drive, and what Jay started experiencing at this point in the treatment were panic attacks that he described as he felt so anxious as if he was going to die. There was also a twitching of the eye and bouts of insomnia. And the body took center stage, this time with neck contractures, sudden cramps, and muscle spasms. And a complaint and a search of nomination, many visits to doctors, as I think Jay was trying to find a name, and also a complaint that even though he said that psychoanalysis had been very helpful, a lifesaver, but nevertheless knew nothing about the body. In a way, this is true. I knew nothing about Jay's body. And this ignorance on my side helped. Jay had the upper hand. The only knowledge that was going to be produced was from Jay's unconscious. And it was necessary in this negative phase of the analysis for a movement away from the symptom to the creation of a re-noting, the invention of what we may call in Lacanian terms a sinthome. I maintained my presence as a big other, but a failed big other, to be sure, but a big other that was always there. Someone who was incomplete, maybe at times stupid, annoying, ignorant, but somebody who would not dump Jay. If Jay wanted to leave the treatment, it was going to be Jay's decision. I was going to maintain myself in that position. And separation and attachment played an important role, was a complicated element. I will try to, in the interest of time, not going too much into details, but Jay was born under the label of a miracle baby. The mother of Jay was a single mother who did not maintain a relationship with Jay's father after Jay was born. Nevertheless, Jay had the presence of the body of the father, bodily presence of the father, not just as a name, because he was present in a presential form on and off in Jay's life, but always in a sort of very painful manner. He would never could take for granted the father's bodily presence, and always had, as Jay said, mixed feelings. Often the father would make arrangements to come and fetch him for a weekend and then would not show up. And in a way, Jay's report about the father was that I felt I was always waiting for him. What I think is important to see here in terms of what brought up the resolution of Jay's analysis, and with that I move to the last part of my presentation, was that something new emerged, and it was a sort of a Joycean solution, I may say, that Jay never felt he was trapped in a body, the woman, man, and there was never this idea of bodily entrapment. There was something in his bodily being that was always as a disadvantage, always underperforming, that there was something always defective. It was a body that reminded him that he was born female, and even after years of monthly injections of testosterone, after top surgery a decade earlier, double mastectomy, there was a sort of reconciliation between Jay and his body, but always with a sense of astonishment. And Jay would say, whenever I am about to take a shower, I look at myself in the mirror, and every time I see my body naked, I'm always reminded of this female past, and somehow surprised, still puzzled. And I think it's interesting that there is an evolution in Jay's relationship to his body, and I think there is something. Perhaps at the level of the real, of the jouissance in the body, the distribution of jouissance, that was maybe at an impasse, that could not be operating as an effect of metaphor. Some of the symptoms he was experiencing could not be approached by speech, needed something at the level of the creation to be repositioned. And this is something that Lacan learned when he turned his attention to the work of artists, and specifically to one very gifted artist, James Joyce, and saying that for some artists, the most perfect creation is their ego, and that the creation of an ego is similar to the creation of a body. And at this juncture, when the treatment with Jay produced a series of changes that were resolved by way of artistry, by way of the sinthome. The object voice, the screaming that were in the crisis, that were crises, there were all these cries of help, appealing to another, also the voice of the superego that needed to be mute in the alcohol bouts. We could see that this acoustic feel of the invocatory drive acquired a new dimension, that when Jay started a business selling vintage vinyl records and getting a loan from his mother, he started a business selling and buying LPs, long plays, vintage records. And here we see that the object A was able to leave the field of the big other and became an object that circulated, that he could reclaim in a way that was specific to him. And I quote Jay, because this is quite revealing. He said, "Not everyone listens to the music I like, but those who like it, love it," end quote. He was, in a way, working as an entrepreneur, but he didn't feel that he was a pioneer, neither as a trans man, not as a businessman, because the big other was castrated. And the object that was circulating was something that could connect him to others, granting a social link, but he could do this leaving a singular mark, a singular contribution that he could offer using his unique know-how that, in fact, what he was trying was to leave an inscription, to leave a signature. And at this point, the panic attacks were resolved because of his business. He was forced to travel a lot, and he overcame panic attacks. He had a severe fear of flying, and he was able to overcome that. And here we see a very interesting moment of self-nomination. Jay's father had been for a while working as a DJ, and for his business, Jay created a business persona known as JJ. He even named his company J Music, with the caption, "The Joys of J Music." So he went from being called Jessica at birth to renaming himself Jay, and most lately to be known in the music business as JJ. So even though he had never heard of James Joyce, his sinthome curiously rewrote a Joycean solution. This solution was quite stable, but became a little difficult, even though Jay managed to resolve it, around issues of paternity, when Alisa, his second girlfriend, started talking about wishing to have a baby. And here is when we see the other side of sex would be that is ineluctably tied to the death drive. And here is, we go back to this idea of castration as the rock of death, that has to do with the acceptance of mortality, a fact not unrelated to the desire to bring children to the world, because reproduction does not imply duplication, as in sexual reproduction. Reproduction proves the mortality of the individual. As Lacan puts it, sexual reproduction means, quote, "The living being, by being subject to sex, has fallen under the blow of individual death." In a way, reproduction does not guarantee immortality, but rather shows the uniqueness of death, the death of each individual. And this death of each individual was in a way shown to Jay, because in his case was clear he was going to make his girlfriend pregnant using sperm from an anonymous donor. So Jay is aware of this idea of death in sex, and also that in a way becoming a parent as a trans man would require something of his singularity as a subject. So we see here that for Freud and Lacan, sexual reproduction and death are in fact two sides of the same coin. And that is in the same way that sexually reproduction requires more than one body, one individual, one person. One body alone cannot reproduce. That in a way, sex living being implies the death of the immortal individual. That sexual difference and sexual reproduction relate to a constitutive lack, that clearly no biological mandate, no dictates could explain fully what is at stake for humans in sexual reproduction, and that to assume a sexual being implies accepting this primal loss of assuming a body that is sex and mortal. And we can see that for Jay, what was most important in terms of his transition was a recognition at the level of his existence that was an invention to survive. There was a rumination about suicide before the transition, and that what he wants to be is recognized as being a man. And we are all driven in a way. Driven by the drive that often could work against the subject's welfare, like we see in many instances in everyday life, in the case of Jay with the addictions, a drive that might be destructive, that Lacan clearly connects with the death drive. And I quote, "The drive, the partial drive, is profoundly a death drive and represents in itself the portion of death in the sex living being," end quote. So death, we could say, is the motor of sexual life. And this trajectory of the drive is skewed, is a sequence that features no endpoint other than death itself. And this, in a way, frontier, this impending doom, is this mortal threshold, is a threshold that often reverberates when we talk about testimonies of gender transition. We hear people talking about stories of rebirth, renaissance, a way of maybe moving between this borderline between life and death. Is often about this very difficult limit between life and death, this existential issue. Slavoj Žižek addresses the question of psychoanalysis and this bedrock of the real, pure negativity, or the rock of the death drive, when he talks about the death drive. And I quote Žižek here: "In this perspective, the death drive, this dimension of radical negativity, cannot be reduced to an expression of alienated social conditions. It defines la condition humaine as such. There is no solution, no escape from it. The thing to do is not to overcome, to abolish it, but to come to terms with it, to learn to recognize it in its terrifying dimension, and then, on the basis of this fundamental recognition, to try to articulate a modus vivendus with it." So Žižek is telling us that what psychoanalysis is proposing is how to live with the death drive. And maybe, as Freud admitted in Analysis Terminable and Interminable, that even when psychoanalysis goes very far, it cannot go beyond this. And Lacan himself hinted at this limit encountered in the analytic cure, between a rock and a hard place, we may say, in a formulation that he presented in the 1970s during his lectures in the United States. And I quote him: "An analysis should not be pushed too far. When the analysand feels he's happy to be alive, it is enough. The analysis should not go any farther than the moment when life is livable. Thank God," continues Lacan, "we don't make the analysand so normal that they will end psychotic." So to conclude, one important lesson I learned from analysands who identify as trans is this, that the key issue is not so much gender as life and death. And this is something that is underlined by, for instance, Griffin Hansbury, when he says that itself transitioning is, quote, "in some way a kind of death." So it is important to insist on this issue that beyond the conundrum of sex and gender, there is this issue, this life and death border. And this is maybe returning when Lacan proposed that the mythical seer, the man-woman Tiresias, should be the role model for all psychoanalysts. He indeed called Tiresias the patron saint of psychoanalysis. And this legend that was formalized in Ovid's Metamorphosis Book 3 has it that Tiresias became a prophet after having changed sex twice. First, he was a man, then as a man, came upon two copulating snakes, separated them, the ghost punished him for his interference in the natural process and transformed him into a woman. He remained a woman for 7 years, which allowed him to experience many aspects of femininity. And Tiresias, as a woman, sees again two entangled snakes 7 years later, separates them, and the spell is undone. Tiresias is at this point again a man. Tiresias was asked by Jupiter who would have more pleasure in sex. And he was able to reveal to the gods the ultimate secret of sexuality, and he reckoned that women would enjoy sex 9 times more than men. And Juno, who had proposed the contrary, She argued that men enjoyed more than women, was upset, and punished the Tiresias for the indiscretion, blinding him. As a compensation, Jupiter gave Tiresias the gift of prophecy. When Lacan picks up Tiresias, the patron saint of psychoanalysis, he's offering less a model of sexuation founded on the denaturalization of sexuality, but rather the awareness that sexuation is about issues of jouissance. That what we are learning here is that psychoanalysis needs to learn from the trans experience and deal with all sorts of gender trouble and body trouble, but above all, learn maybe from the experience of someone like Tiresias, who knows what bisexuality really means, and that the psychoanalyst therefore needs to be moved by a desire for pure difference, be ready to embody the semblance of the eternal missing object, and that in fact the psychoanalyst needs, like Tiresias, to be somehow already dead, like in the Odyssey, incarnating truth beyond life and death. And this is expressed perhaps by a positioning of the psychoanalyst beyond normative ideologies of sexuality and the fear of trespassing on the limits of life and death. And that will make the journey of psychoanalysis worthwhile. The important lesson here that I would like to conclude with is that a psychoanalyst needs to have what we may call a trans desire, a desire to go beyond binaries, a desire to overcome the limit of mortal existence, to allow the ethical decision of being. With that, I'll stop for today, and I would like to thank you for your time and listening, and I would like to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was absolutely gripping, coming from sexuality and gender, the sociological constructions, to psychoanalysis, from anatomy to desire, and eventually ending with Tiresias as the patron saint of psychoanalysis. I mean, it made me think of various things, and I don't want to take up a lot of time because I'm sure there'll be many questions. But before people start asking questions, I suppose just a thought to sort of maybe to, if you could elaborate on that a little bit, it'll be because it was very interesting how you were, in a way, connecting the question of transsexuality and sexuality at large with life and death, and how Eros and Thanatos, in that sense, are marked on the body as well, and how the question of sexual embodiment relates to death, especially what in the title you call the knot between life and death. But I was kind of thinking to what extent this goes back to a kind of a new relation possibly between sinthome as a creative construction, as an invention of a name, and something like death drive, because that really made me think in this paper, this sort of very strong connection that is emerging between sinthome and death drive, and sinthome as a sort of, let's say, a way of living with the death drive, as you said, in relation to Zizek. So yeah, I mean, it's just a thought. It's not really a question, but I thought I'll just.
No, but the idea is that we have to live. This is the interesting thing, that the unconscious thinks itself immortal, but we are, I think, the only animals aware of our own death. So we are, as Lacan says, for us, death is always a matter of belief. It's sort of something we need to believe in. It's not really something we accept. So I think what is important here is that the sinthome, as you said very well, I think I agree fully with what you have said, that it's a form of creating a way to live, finding a livable solution. And it requires an artifice. And when I talk about artistry, I don't follow the Heideggerian idea of beaux-arts. Is not the art, of course, as we are comparing the idea of the sinthome with a very gifted artist like James Joyce, but more the idea of art in the sense of how art was in Greek techne, the idea of a know-how, that only we can live fully if we know how to live, knowing that we'll die, but we can introduce that in a creative way, that
right.
a creation ex nihilo, knowing there's nothing, this void, this negativity, there is a creation that renders life livable. That otherwise life, I think, but it's relatively impossible, relatively difficult. And this is what we hear all the time. Like people are always, when they talk about sex, they are talking about bad sex. Or we hear that Lacan uses a 4-letter word to say patients, all they talk about is sex. And he uses the F word, not sex. It's less polite that I'm trying to be today. And he says, and bad one. So that we are always at odds, that we are not at ease in our bodies. We are not at ease in life. We don't deal well with sexuality unless we find a know-how, a technique, sort of artistry, like a craftsmanship would be. We learn our own way how to deal with this difficult constraint, which is knowing that we will die. On the other hand, as also Lacan says, and I send you, for those interested, there is this very interesting exchange. This comes from a lecture he gave in Louvain in the 70s. It's available on YouTube, in which he also says that if we were going to live forever, life would be even more unbearable. So happily this will end, but nevertheless, we need to invent something to go on living. And in that sense, the sinthome, and that each solution will be unique for each singular subject.
Right.
And in that sense, as delightful, and when you were talking about the death drive, is more on the side of the principle pleasure, in the sense of enjoying the least possible. Jouissance is at times too much on the disruptive side of the death drive. Is enjoying the least possible. And also what Lacan says, that by way of the sinthome, we can enjoy our own unconscious, but in a way that will not kill us fully.
Right, sure. Thank you so much for that response. So yeah, I mean, the floor is open for questions. So if you want to talk, please let me know by pinging in the chat box, and I will unmute you so that you can ask your question. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to directly unmute yourself due to the Zoom settings that we have for the session. So just let me know here by pinging, or you could write your question. You could type it out in the chat box, and I would relay it to Patricia. So yeah, questions, comments, please go ahead.
Do we have any questions? Or?
Not yet. So yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I think yeah, I think yeah. I'm going to unmute you. Yeah, I think Ganesh, you can unmute yourself now. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Patricia, just a minute. I will also be switching my video on. So that. Yes.
Hi.
Hello. Good to see you again, Patricia. And I think the session has given me more than what I know now. And thank you very much for that. So I think the analogy that came to me maybe towards the end of it was, if it is about making life livable, maybe sex is about making do with what our bodies can do. Or learning to make do with what we can do.
Yes, because often that's something that is very nicely developed. I don't know if you are familiar with Badiou, Alain Badiou. He does a very nice reading in his book. I think I happen to have it here. Impress of Love is the English version. That often when with sex is what we can do and what we cannot do. That he says in the encounter between two bodies is in fact the encounter between two imaginaries. Is this approximation of two naked bodies is two imaginaries, and in a way the only real is narcissistic, that will have to do with the pure pleasure of whatever erogenous zone may be involved at that moment. But if is sex that happens to overlap with love, there is something that could make up for this, in a way, fall of the imaginary, or this purely imaginary idea, this void, this negativity entailed by sex, because we may have an overlapping of sex that is at the level of the imaginary and having to do with non-being, and love that would approach the being of the other. That in the love encounter, we approach the being of the other, and in that sense could, I don't think could, compensate may not be the right word. It makes do with that nothing. That when we love and really truly love a person, we know the negativity, we know very well, and we love them anyway. We know all the things we don't like, and we still like the person. So it's a moment where perhaps this is a good way that perhaps there is something at the level of love, if we can live with the death drive, that we need to, something about loving life, if we could extemporize, that something at the level of letting be and being, if we can live with the death drive. And this is something that is theorized. There is a text by Lacan when I think is the introduction to the German translation of Écrit. He talks about a modified form of love at the end of analysis that I think has to do with this acceptance of the death drive, or this, I wouldn't put it, it sounds a little counterintuitive, loving the death drive, but there is something in the dimension of love that allow us not to be totally annihilated by the death drive. And that could happen if maybe in a sexual encounter, there will be something at the level of love as well that would relate to being differently.
Thank you so much, Ganesh, for the question. I mean, we have a couple of questions queued up here. So, right, let me just go to Dahlia. I think she's next, and Dahlia Nivelle. She's asking whether this model can account for asexuality in trans subjectivities. But Dahlia, I've requested to unmute you. So if you have any addition to that written question, please go ahead and talk it out. It's up to you. But I think, yeah.
Not really. That's it. That's all I wanted to ask.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sure.
Yeah, I think if asexuality, if we think of asexuality, at least in the nomenclature we hear a lot in the United States, asexuality would be people who align themselves outside the gender boundary and often extract themselves from this imaginary encounter between two bodies. So in that sense, would be at the level of finding a new form of sexual positioning within the possibilities offered by the fail answers, because I think we need to keep in mind that when Lacan talks about the formulae of sexuation, there are fail solutions. It's not that he's saying that assuming a masculine positioning or a feminine position are the right way to go. They are attempts to provide an answer to an impossible question. So there are failed ways of coming up with a solution, and we could multiply the fail answers available. That's in the sense of identitary labels. And if we think exclusively from a psychoanalytic perspective, for psychoanalysis, the subject emerges when identity fails. So in that sense, all sexuality is asexuality, in the sense that when Lacan gives primacy to the object A, and he uses the letter A that comes from the French word autre, means that we take a part, we extract a piece of the other, big other, as a small other, and is a partial object, a part object, a I don't know what, in French, the je ne sais quoi, what makes someone tick, that is always something we don't know of. We suddenly feel attracted to a person, not really knowing why. Is this object cause of desire that triggers the desire, but is not fully localizable. And I hope I was able to illustrate, I went too quickly with the case of Jay, but we saw how the object was inefficient when he became materialized, because he drank and then he needed to drink again and again. So the object was somehow carried in the pocket and eventually damp. He was himself seen as the fecal object by the partner in this terrible way they were treating each other. And then eventually embodied more of a trigger of desire than a trigger of pure jouissance and subjective destitution. When it acquired this acoustic dimension by working with music and was able to provide his unique way of listening, to give it to people, because as in this business selling LP, he would go to fairs and select what records to buy, and he knew he has a very peculiar taste, and that there was a know-how specific to him that would allow others to experience pleasure. So in a way, the object A was no longer so close to the body. It could circulate and be passed to others. And in that sense, it was, let's say, a less deadly object. We are talking about the death right, a little emptied, more emptied of jouissance.
Thank you so much. I think Shammoshet has a question. So Shammoda, you can please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, Patricia.
Hello, how are you?
Pleasure to hear you again. Hello. Yes. I have two questions. One, which you have partially addressed in the very last portion of the comment you just made. It was a question about the trajectory or the vicissitudes of the object nothing in this particular case. And what in this particular subjective history could have allowed or helped or selected, in a way, the invocatories as the place for the best ciphering of jouissance to make it most livable. Is it something that you think was a result of a contingent relation to the encounter with the father, the way that you said the father's presence, the bodily presence could not be quite taken for granted, and there was a way of seeking it, especially in the screaming. Is something like that taking place, or do you say that this is more in terms of, let's say, somebody like Jean-Claude Maléval talking about the voice as a specific, in the very primal alienation to the S1, there is a certain incorporation of the voice that takes place, and in this particular case, is it something structural like that? Or perhaps it does not need to be either contingent or structural, it could be both. It was just something that I would like to have thought with you a little bit more. That is one question. The other is, in a case like J, or JJ, as he nominates himself, is it at all useful to continue to think in terms of neurosis or psychosis, or is this a case where such a distinction does not actually help us in any way in the clinic?
Okay, so thank you. Two questions in one. So I will address first I think it's very interesting when you're bringing up the idea of the voice, because there was, for instance, in the fights, it was interesting that they needed to be interrupted by the police. So there was a search for a limit of a sort of embodiment of the superego, if supposedly the police are representatives of the law. That's maybe something we could discuss, but in the case of Jay, there was an appeal, finding a limit by way of transgressing it in the stupor, post ingest of a lot of alcohol or drugs, was a way of traversing a limit in order to encounter in it. And there was an appeal to the superego, we may call, and the superego, as Lacan says, is always heard, like a commandment, enjoy, enjoy, I hear, and jouir, we hear there the jouissance, that was in a way finding something of the father as representative of the law, as a representative of a prohibition that comes as an injunction in the term of a voice. And for Jay himself, his own voice moved from coming externally to be a voice he could assume during the early phases of the transition. Jay commented that taking testosterone, his voice itself changed and drop, but still he would be upset because at times when he would talk over the phone, there was a moment of hesitation and people may not be able to identify what his gender of choice was. And then this dimension, this acoustic dimension, can separate a little from the body. And JJ, and it's important that this is indeed how we should refer to JJ, with this effect of self-nomination. That was this artistic name that he creates, assumes a voice that separates from his body and comes to circulate and be recognized in a way that makes him feel better represented, that is a sort of less obscene superego that starts operating. And I think that was a movement of the analysis that allows him to deal with the law not as a literalized external sanction that could only be approached. I don't think it's a diagnosis for Jay, but was more dealt in a sort of perverse strategy. And here I will play with the homophone in French of perversion, version of the father, literally. And he was, in a way, defying the law. There was a defiance of the law in needing to have the police come in and knock at the door to make them stop the fight. And then there is a sort of more feeling at ease in this living with limits and restrictions, and being able to separate and let the object A circulate when the voice can be disembodied and not be a voice that is punishing him, but providing pleasure. And that, in a way, answers the second part of your question, or the second question in your questions, which was about structure. I think it's important to think in terms of structures, but in terms of structures not as fixed entities. I take inspiration from Nestor Brownstein, who says that a psychotic, for instance, is not psychotic 24 hours a day, even though nobody changes structure. And this is said by Lacan. You can cure a hysteric of anything but the hysteria. Once a psychic structure is there, analysis will not change it. But that there are ways of thinking a subject. And at times, I think it is helpful, I think in the clinical practice, to think in terms of structures to determine, are we dealing with a case of psychosis? Are we dealing with a case of neurosis? And I would always recommend caution, because if, for instance, we are dealing with a psychotic analysis and believing it's neurotic, we can really hurt the analysand by making an intervention that could cause harm. So I think the idea of doing no harm should appeal. And in that sense, we would work with the diagnosis as a working hypothesis. That is always a working hypothesis that we may need to revise during the treatment, that we need to have that in consideration in order to be able to conduct the treatment. We need to think in terms of structures. And I think indeed it's still relevant for the clinical practice to think, are we dealing with a neurosis? Are we dealing with the case of psychosis? Are we dealing with perversion as a model that could be mobile, a model that we could then revisit? And that's why, and that's why I think we are here today. Analysts should never be alone, should always be working with other analysts, should present cases in clinical ateneus, could discuss with colleagues, do supervision, control cases. I think it's in that exchange with others that an analyst could maybe test those hypotheses. They are working hypotheses, but necessary.
Thank you. And in this particular case, your hypothesis was what?
I would say it was more a case of obsessional neurosis, which is very, very prevalent. That has, if you think of the paradigm of obsessional neurosis that you see with the rat man, it could be a very severe neurosis, but still within the realm of neurosis, because JJ works with metaphor. There is very well positioned in the symbolic. It's not and the imaginary was not as fallen as one could be led to believe by maybe my rapid presentation of the case. And I think Lacan tells us that the closest you can get to psychosis within neurosis is obsessional neurosis. But again, I'm open for verification. So it's a working hypothesis.
Thank you so much. I think we have more or less run out of time. So unless there's one final question, we could end the conversation here, but I'm just checking. Of course, there's a raise hand function that I forgot to tell you about, but some of you are wise enough to, of course, use it. Please feel free to raise your hand. That's another way of saying, I have a question, and I would unmute you. So in case there's another question, I mean, 3 is a good Lacanian number. We have had 3 questions, but I'm just looking for a +1. And there was already a +1 in Shamboda's question because there were 2 questions there. So possibly we have a sinthome there as the fourth order. So that might be a good point to maybe end our talk today. So this is to once again thank you, Patricia, for taking out time from your busy schedule to do this, and let me also thank this patient and thoughtful audience for the questions, for paying attention. And it was wonderful. I wish we could have this in person, but then there are situations at this point that would not enable it. But I'm very happy, and I'm very grateful to you for being able to make it.
Thank you for the opportunities. These are the moments that make the pandemic a little more pleasant or less unpleasant, to be more honest. Right. So thank you. It's good to have at least this exchange, and also the possibility of people from different geographies to come at once, and hopefully soon, next time, would be with physical bodies present, not just virtual flat bodies that make for a different kind of exchange and different kind of production of symptom. But today wasn't bad. We produced a symptom, so we could feel, at least for today, quite satisfied.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day for everyone. Good night, good day, good evening, whatever. And thank you so much again for joining in. I think Shamoda is doing that. I think we should end with a clap. Thank you so much.
Thank you to you for your attention. Thank you.